unfortunately a segue to another very important thing that happened over the weekend. President Biden making his thoughts clear about nuclear Armageddon. Let's put this up there on the screen. This is from the president, who remarks that he made at a Democratic fundraiser. Personally, I think he should give these remarks to all of us, but here's what he said: that the danger of nuclear Armageddon is the highest since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Biden said that Putin's threats to use tactical nuclear weapons are not a joke. He says, quote, "We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis." Quote, he is not joking when he talks about the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons or biological and chemical weapons, because his military is, might say, significantly underperforming. And he says, quote, "I don't think there is any such thing as the ability to easily use tactical nuclear weapons and not end up with Armageddon." So President Biden echoing something that, we've said here on the show, which is like, listen, once you go nuclear, whether it has a tactical, quote unquote, use on the ground for an operation or strategic use like an ICBM, once you break that threshold, all bets are off, and we are almost certainly going to be in a war with Russia, especially given what the Baltic states have made clear in response would be. And President Biden making it very clear that he believes that. Now, the question then arises, if you believe that, are you going to change U.S. policy? I mean, since you seem to believe that, what is your, plan for an off-ramp? I will say, Crystal, I was heartened at one thing that the press did not tout as much, which is in the same speech, he did say, and I want to give him credit for this, I and my team have been looking for ways in order to give him an off-ramp as much as possible. So he does at least have it in his mind. Yeah. We haven't yet seen that in any leaked private communications or active diplomacy with the Russians. As far as I know, it has not happened yet at the presidential level. I know that there was a brief talk once, I think, between the foreign minister and the Secretary of State. There's some quasi, interactions happening, but nothing at the highest level, nothing in Turkey that is significant enough in order to report to anyone. So on the one hand, he says nuclear Armageddon is possible. I'm looking for off-ramps. On the other hand, there's no actual policy yet pursuing that end. So who knows? That's right. I mean, I don't know where his mind is at, and this is always a difficulty with covering Biden. One day he's the guy who comes out of Afghanistan. The other day, he's like, no, we're committed to an unending war in Ukraine. Right. So I'm like, well, who are you?
Right.
Today?
Yeah, and I definitely co-sign your thoughts that these sorts of comments, like, it would be important for the American people to understand the totality of President Biden's thinking and not just have it reserved for donors in New York City. However, there was a lot of pearl clutching about these comments from leaders. You had Macron saying we must speak with prudence when commenting on such matters. You had former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying that these comments were reckless and demonstrating maybe one of the greatest foreign policy failures of the last decades. Here's a quote, "Oh my goodness. First of all, those comments were reckless. I think that even more importantly, they demonstrate maybe one of the greatest foreign policy failures of the last decades, which was the failure to deter Vladimir Putin the same way the Trump administration did for 4 years." When you hear the president talking about Armageddon as a random thought, just using it as a fundraiser, that is a terrible risk to the American people. Listen, I am personally heartened to hear that at least this is somewhere in Biden's mind, the awareness of what an incredibly dangerous situation we're in right now. The fact that he really seems to, at least on some level, understand that we are facing the most significant potential nuclear crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis, that there is no little bit of nuclear war, this idea of quote unquote tactical nuclear weapons and an ability to manage the escalation of that is somewhat fanciful. I am very heartened to hear those comments, even as I indicated, I would prefer them come directly to the American people versus a leak from a donor fundraiser. The other thing to say about this ultimately is that, it seems like, as best we can tell from leaks from the administration and some of the offhanded comments that they've made, at the beginning of this war, when Russia's military failures were so clear, there appeared to be a lot of arrogance from the Biden administration. You had all those comments leaking that were like, we need to end Putin's regime, and the only way out of this is ultimately for Putin to be gone. You even had Biden making some comments to that effect, actually multiple times, saying, calling Putin a war criminal and saying that he must go and these sorts of things. And I think that arrogance at the beginning of this war really short-circuited the best possibility of coming to some sort of ceasefire and peace deal early on. Now, when you want to talk, and we were talking about off-ramps at the time, and it took a lot of heat for that ultimately, and you still take a lot of heat for saying things like that. Now, thinking of how to find that off-ramp is just incredibly difficult, even as, you know, these latest strikes that really hit across all of Ukraine are a reminder that the people who suffer the most, the longer this war goes on, is ultimately the Ukrainians. And then you layer on top of that the chance, as Biden puts it, for nuclear Armageddon, and you really have a horrifying situation. So, you know, I'm glad to see this is at least somewhere in the thinking and the president's mind that we are at this incredibly perilous, terrifying place. But we have yet to see the U.S. policy to match this kind of rhetoric. And ultimately, you know, what they do is what really counts.
Yeah, I think that is what I would underscore more than anything, which is that on a policy level, nothing is reflecting it. And I am really concerned that these comments on nuclear Armageddon happened behind closed doors to a billionaire, not on camera. Like, what is that? To his credit, I encourage everybody to go and watch it. President Kennedy, in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis, before things were quote unquote solved, did a primetime address from the Oval Office where he's like, look, here's the evidence, here's where my head's at, here's what I'm thinking, and here's what I'm saying to the Russians. This is the way that we resolve it. I think pretty much the entire country at one point either watched or was familiar with what the president said in that. President Biden, if you believe we are closer to nuclear Armageddon than any time before the Cuban Missile Crisis, why would you not then be clear about that to the American people? And unfortunately, I think that you and I know the answer to that question, which is if people knew how close that we were, and I really don't think that most people do. Like, look, you know, I love this show. A lot of people watch it, but let's not pretend, even not just our show, I'm doing my whole monologue on this today. Most people don't read the news or are vaguely familiar with what's happening. I don't think they have any clue about how close we are. Well, there's only one way to solve that, which is to really create a major event in which you're like, here's where we are, here's the potential solutions, here's my, you know, position with Russia, and that's where we go from there. Instead, it's to say this stuff behind closed doors for those who are kind of quote unquote in the know to be like, oh my God, we're so close to some sort of nuclear crisis with Russia, and then you continue policy as usual with Ukraine that is on the ground.
Well, and that's the reason why he doesn't do that major address and really lay out the risks, because the fact that we're in this place is in part, at least, due to his administration's policy.
Yeah.
And so the minute you realize how close to the edge we are and what a truly terrifying situation it is, then, you know, the American people are going to go, well, how the hell did we get here? Why did you let us get to this place? Where has been the consideration of the risks of the strategy that we've been employing here? We haven't heard anything about this up until now that we're on the brink of nuclear war. So that's why the comments have to be sort of like hidden behind closed doors at some Democratic Party fundraiser, because to acknowledge the risk of the situation is to acknowledge the failure of the policy that has led us up to this point. So I think that's why you don't hear it. But I mean, certainly the media isn't going to do the job of helping the American people understand what a frightening place we're in right now and the consequences of this action. This is what we've been terrified of the whole way along, that with so little, no debate effectively, so little discussion, so little debate, so little weighing of any potential negative consequences of the actions, we would sleepwalk our way right exactly to this point. And sadly, that is exactly what has happened. And the missed opportunities early on, to the extent that there were, and there's no guarantees in terms of ceasefire talks or peace deals or any of those things. But there is no doubt that in those early days, you remember Ryan Grim was the only person at a White House press briefing that even asked the question, hey, what about diplomacy? Hey, what are you doing to pressure the Ukrainians to try to come to the table and try to come to some kind of a deal so that we don't end up in this hellish dystopian landscape? There was no pressure from the press. They never explained the downside risks of the actions that we were taking, and so that's in part how we end up in this place today. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.